Yep.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to everybody. My name is Kristen Warner and I am the director of the Asia Center Publications Program. And this is our second author talk. We started this series earlier this year, and we're very excited to be able to feature our authors who have recently published books. And so today I'd like to introduce Xiaolu Ma. She will be talking about her new book, Transpatial Modernity. And then our moderator is David Wang. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you because we have a lot of things to talk about today.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristen. Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to this book talk, which features Professor Xiaolu Ma, Associate Professor at the Chinese University or Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong. Xiaolu received her PhD degree in comparative literature from Harvard University, and today we are going to feature her book, which was newly published by Harvard East Asia Center. So the title of the book is Transpatial Modernity, Chinese Cultural Encounters with Russia via Japan. I had this great pleasure and honor to have read this book and its, previous incarnations, and I could tell everybody, for me, this is one of the best I've ever read over the past 10 years in terms of East Asian and world comparative literature. This is a groundbreaking attempt to bring three civilizations, China, Japan, and Russia, together to observe how they interacted with each other at one of the most tumultuous moments in modern history, in both literary and historical sense. So this is a book which is well worthy of discussion, not only for literature lovers, but also for those who are concerned about the dynamics of modern world civilizations. So today we have about 1 hour or so for conversation and a discussion, but we'll start first with Professor Ma's presentation, which runs for about 30 minutes or so. After that, I probably will make some of the observations, a couple of questions for conversation, and then we'll open the floor to everyone. Hopefully, you could bring up your questions for further discussion. So without further ado, Xiaolu, would you please start your presentation today first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for your kind introduction. Let me first share my screen. Does it look good to you?
Yes.
Okay. And also, I would like to thank all the support that I have received through the publication process of this manuscript from Harvard University Asia Center, and also for this opportunity to talk about my book today. So this monograph addresses a complex dynamics among three actors: Russia, the rising power at the periphery of the West; China, the declining empire in the East; and Japan, the up-and-coming Asian leader that was edging itself into the world of Western powers. The losses that Russia and China suffered in battles against Japan during the Meiji era add further drama to the triangulation. By highlighting the role of Russia and Japan, whose ambiguous cultural identities challenge any oversimplified bifurcation into East or West, traditional or modern, weak or strong, this book sheds new light on the Chinese conceptualization of modernity. In the last decades of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century, Chinese writers adapted, translated, and intertextualized Russian literature via the intermediary of Japanese scholarship and creative writing, drawing on sources gathered through fieldwork in China, Russia, Japan, and North America, my research is probably the first in English and one of the few in any language to examine the triangular relationship among Chinese, Japanese, and Russian literatures and cultures. I argue that the examination of relay transculturation offers a new understanding of the dynamics of cross-culture contact zones, and probing the implications of cultural brokerage and its function in the transculturation process gives us a vital new perspective on Chinese literature and culture in local, regional, and global contexts. For this talk, I will first introduce the cultural background that inspired me to write this manuscript. I will then talk about the structure of my book. Through this process, I will explain the idea of relay transculturation, by which I mean cultural exchange among at least 3 cultures, one of which serves primarily as an intermediary. In the second half of my talk, I will focus on the introduction of my book, in which I delve into modernity, this concept, in particular, transpatial modernity. There were 2 questions I tried to tackle. First, is it possible to say that Russia provided China the possibility of an alternative modernity? And second, why I consider non-synchronic transspatiality a key feature of Chinese modernity. No one denies the tremendous impact of Russian literature and culture on modern China. The formation of the Soviet Union that ended centuries of imperial rule and set in motion political and social changes had taught the Chinese the power of revolution and drove the Chinese to celebrate revolutionary literature. We are all familiar with how Russian and Soviet literature provided Chinese readers with an inspiring version of modernity. This was especially true after Chairman Mao's talks at Yan'an Forum of Literature and Art in 1942, in which he cited Lenin's 1905 remark, "Art belongs to the people," beginning the gradual transformation of artistic and literary production in China into a political socialist campaign. We are also familiar with the story about how the introduction of socialist realism into China shaped the formation of Chinese aesthetic standards in literature and art for decades. In general, there has been a tendency for the studies on Sino-Russian cultural interactions to emphasize the period after the 1917 October Revolution. Although the Russian and Soviet social impact in China reached its zenith beginning in the 1920s, the cultural trends of the late Qing period of the 1900s and 1910s prefigured Chinese enthusiasm towards Russian culture. Therefore, my project opens its historical narrative in the late Qing dynasty to tease out the long-neglected history of early Russo-Japanese Sino-transculturation. In this book, I contend that Russia played a unique role in the Chinese construction of modernity. But to better understand its significance, it is crucial to also evaluate the significance of a third culture, namely Japanese culture, as an intermediary. To use Diary of a Madman, for example, it is Lu Xun's first well-known short story and the alleged first vernacular short story in modern Chinese, and it was influenced by the Russian writer Gogol's short story of the same name. However, Lu Xun's initial encounter with Gogol's Diary of a Madman was actually through Japanese writer Futabatei Shimei's Japanese translation, and Lu Xun's treatment of cannibalism as a major theme in Diary of a Madman was arguably shaped by heated contemporary discussions in Japan on national character and cannibalism. Thus, the Chinese transculturation of Russian literature has not always been a direct process from the source culture of Russia to the target culture of China. Japan has played a significant role as an intermediary. Although the Chinese learned about Russian culture and language more than a century before the Japanese, the Chinese did not show great interest in Russian literature until the end of the 19th century. The 19th century Russian Emperor Nicholas I once sent over 10 boxes of books to Qing Emperor Daoguang. However, the Qing government undervalued these books. Some officials even suggested returning these books and decided not to, only because it would be considered an offensive diplomatic gesture. The Chinese said among themselves, quote, "We think that Russian books are worse than the books of Britain, Germany, and France. It is not necessary to translate them," end quote. In a word, although the Chinese government established its first Russian institute in 1708, almost a century before the Japanese did, the lack of Chinese enthusiasm about Russia prevented further development in Russian language education in China during the 18th and 19th centuries. Apart from the translation of diplomatic documents, the Chinese barely translated any Russian literature prior to 1900. Meanwhile, Russia and Japan knew very little of one another before the 19th century, largely due to the seclusion laws introduced by the Tokugawa government. Nevertheless, Japan eventually introduced systematic education in the Russian language at the end of the 18th century. Despite a late start, the Japanese quickly picked up steam in translating Russian literature. In the 1880s, famous Russian writers including Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc., they all were introduced into Japan. Although most translators focused on short stories or novellas, famous Russian novels such as Tolstoy's War and Peace or Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment were also rendered into Japanese. As a result, unlike in Japan before 1911, where famous translators of Russian literature such as Futabatei Shimei translated Russian literature directly from its original language of Russian and exerted great influence on the modernization of Japanese literature, not many Russian works were translated into Chinese. And among those that were, most of them were secondary translations from other languages, especially from Japanese. It is not surprising that Japanese translation became an important source for Chinese readers wishing to learn about Russia. Although the Chinese government preferred European countries as destinations for exchange students, Japan hosted the greatest number of Chinese students seeking a modern education. Zhang Zhidong expanded on the benefits of studying in Japan rather than the West. Quote, "Regarding the best country in which to study abroad, Japan is better than Western countries. Number one, because of the closer distance, traveling expenses are cheaper, so more students can be sent to Japan. Number two, since Japan is closer to China, it is easier to inspect the schools. Number three, Japanese is similar to Chinese, and so is easy to master. And number four, Western books are fairly complicated, but the Japanese have already removed or revised the parts that were not important." End quote. This leads me to the concept of relay transculturation, a key concept in my work, by which I mean cultural exchange among at least three cultures, one of which serves primarily as an intermediary. The game of Chinese whispers, or the American game telephone, in which a message is repeated from one person to the next until at the end it is totally unrecognizable, is an apt metaphor for such a dynamic. Relay transculturation, has been a prominent cultural phenomenon in the negotiation between the East and West. For example, when East Asia culture was first introduced to the Western world, many German and Dutch readers relied on French and English intermediaries due to lack of specialists from their own nations. And in the period of colonization in Asia, the colonizers also served as transmitters, bringing the West into colonized regions. During Chinese cultural seclusion in the Qing dynasty, Western culture was relayed into China through German and Italian missionaries, while the Dutch imported Western knowledge into Japan. Traditional transcultural studies have tended to focus on direct transculturation between culture A and culture B. Pascal Casanova, for example, draws our attention to the dynamics between center and periphery. Deleuze and Guattari underscore the significance of the minor as a counterbalance to the major. We're all familiar with Lydia Liu's concept of translingual practice, which contrasts the roles of host and guest. Taking the Russo-Japanese Sino-transculturation into consideration, we realize that modernity need not imply clashes between two distinctive sides, the sorts of power struggles that have persistently been the focal point for research on transcultural negotiations. Rather than locking literatures and cultures into oppositional binaries such as center versus periphery, major versus minor, or host versus guest, we might allow for dynamic interactions and emphasize the vitality of all partisans. To better describe the phenomenon of relay transculturation, this book is organized into 5 chapters. The first chapter provides a panoramic overview in which I introduce the transcultural encounters between Russia, Japan, and China at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. This overview provides critical context. I trace how Japan began as the major and, in some cases, only cultural broker in the Chinese reception of Russian literature in the late Qing dynasty, how its impact was minimized when the Chinese started to train their own specialists in Western literature, and how Japan once again served as one of the most influential cultural mediators when proletarian literature became fashionable. The remaining 4 chapters are case studies, each of which presents a different paradigm of relay transculturation. Chapter 2 examines the early relay translations of Russian literature in East Asia, with a special focus on the Chinese translations of Pushkin's The Captain's Daughter and Lermontov's Hero of Our Time, translations that were based on Japanese counterparts. This chapter reveals that in the process of Russian transculturation via Japan, traditional Chinese culture also undertook a convoluted journey, eventually returning to China by way of Japan. Chapter 3 interrogates the metamorphosis Russian nihilist stories underwent in being transplanted to Chinese soil via Japanese sources. This chapter demonstrates how the Russo-Japanese Sino-transcultural trajectory was sometimes further complicated when the Western European world was involved, since the Japanese did not adopt Russian culture directly from Russia, but through the mediation of Western Europe. Chapter 4 discusses the appropriation of Tolstoy's religious humanism in East Asia. Centering around Zhou Zuoren's reading of Tolstoyism via Japanese scholarship, this chapter inspects the hidden drive behind Zhou Zuoren's proposal of human literature, a crucial manifesto in the rise of Chinese modernity. This chapter exposes how the transcultural processes caused ideologies such as humanism and individualism to transform and diverge, eventually leading to factionalism among Chinese intellectuals. Chapter 5 focuses on Lu Xun's hard translation, a controversial practice that received more criticism than praise. This chapter explores a situation in which the transcultural conduit was not limited to a single culture by investigating how German sources complemented and competed against Japanese ones in the circulation of Russian literature. The 4 cases tackle different aspects of Chinese modernity. The first case addresses the development of modern sentiments through relay translation of romantic stories. The second case interrogates the political significance of novel writing in East Asia, as manifested by the metamorphosis of a popular genre into a serious political statement. The third case traces the promulgation of humanism, one of the ideas central to the May 4th movement and its close connection with the Chinese interpretation of individualism. The fourth case considers possibilities for language reform and vernacularization, realized by borrowing the lexicon and syntax of foreign languages in translation. These four cases help me tackle the issue of considering Russian modernity as a substitute for Western modernity. Indeed, the demarcation between Russian culture and other Western European cultures makes it tempting to conclude that Russia simply provided Chinese with a distinct and alternative vision of modernity. However, just as the notional hegemony of Euro-modernity demands alignment of other cultures with Western European models, so too it is possible to oversimplify the role Russia played for China by substituting a new centrism for the old one. The transcultural entanglement between Russia and Western Europe makes it impossible to separate out Russian modernity as strictly distinct. The diverse trajectories of modernity, which are too entangled to isolate any given approach from the others, makes it impractical to assert a unified definition of any given form modernity may take. Another feature I would like to highlight is non-synchronic transspatiality, a phenomenon that frequently shows up in my observations. Modernity is predominantly defined temporally, yet the journey of modern ideas and concepts from Russia to Japan and ultimately China draws our attention to the interdependence of time and space in the construction of modernity. Both phenomena are essential to the chronotopic analysis of global modernity. The Russian equivalent to modernity is современность, which is composed of two parts, с and временность. S as a prefix derives from s in Proto-Slavic, meaning together with, and временность comes from the noun time or время. Hence, современность refers to the qualities and or things that go together with the current moment. Simply put, it refers to the reality of the present, whatever happens or exists at the moment. Современность, therefore, implies a certain simultaneity realized by togetherness or spatial companionship. To better understand the non-simultaneity of modernity, I invoke the phenomenon of transspace, which is defined by Ariana Danino as, quote, the transcultural dimension that lies beyond the divides, often commercially or ideologically emphasized of cultures, end quote. Along these lines, the study of Chinese modernity should not be restricted to Chinese territories. Rather, it involves innumerable incidents that transmute time across space. In fact, the transspatial nature of modernity means that it should never be studied as a unified, integral, and static entity. The development of modernity in any location is subject to constant intervention and interruption from other places and times. To better explain non-synchronic transspatiality, I would like to show you the following text. This record comes from a 1903 essay by the prominent Chinese reformist and intellectual leader Liang Qichao. The essay offered one of the earliest opportunities for Chinese readers to learn about Russian literature and three of its acclaimed writers. Those familiar with Russian literature might be disappointed by the errors in this record. The dates listed are far from accurate. Gogol's Dead Souls was first published in 1842. Turgenev's Sportsman Sketches was a short story collection published in 1852, with a series of stories that had first appeared in the journal The Contemporary from 1847 to 1851. And Henderson wrote Who is to Blame over a span of 5 years from 1841 to 1846. This record appeared in a 1903 essay titled On the Rationalist Party in New People, a journal recognized as the first in-depth Chinese language introduction to 19th century Russian radical movements. Liang Qichao presented these three entries as the starting point in a chronology of rationalist movement based on the 1902 book Anarchism in Modern Times by Japanese scholar Kamiyama Santalo. Kamiyama's work, which stood for many years as the most comprehensive book on rationalism in Japanese, was the key source for Chinese intellectuals such as Liang Qichao to learn about Russia. However, Liang's limited knowledge of Japanese and unfamiliarity with Russian culture resulted in the transmission errors that marred this introduction of Russian literature into China. The errors notwithstanding, Liang has deliberately repackaged the historical narrative and readjusted the timeline for the benefits of his Chinese audience. Kamiyama's narrative of Russian revolutionary history takes into account the early years of the 19th century. Liang's account begins in 1845. The 1840s are a significant decade in Chinese history. They mark a turning point directly after the First Opium War, which had forced the Chinese to acknowledge its inferiority through a series of unequal treaties with other countries, including Russia. Chinese historians thus widely recognize the 1840s as the start of China's modern history. By placing the Russian revolutionary movement's starting point squarely in that same decade, Liang Qichao aligns Russian and Chinese history in a way that implies other parallels, particularly connected with social transformation. In examining this discrepancy between Russian and Chinese understandings of modernity, we come to witness what Ernest Bloch calls the non-simultaneity of the simultaneous. Although Russian culture informed Chinese modernity, the collective culture experiences and historical timelines in the two countries varied significantly. Observing different social classes' divergent relations to the present, Bloch proposed the idea of non-synchronism within cultural and capitalist modernization. He emphasizes how the traditions of the past continue to be effective in the present and lead to non-contemporaneous coexistence of cultural experience. As he writes, quote, "Not all people exist in the same now. We do so only externally, through the fact that they can be seen today, but they are thereby not yet living at the same time with the others. They rather carry an earlier element with them," end quote. Such non-synchronism, which carries a certain devotion to the past, leads to multifarious approaches to modernity, which he identifies with the polyrhythm of multispatial and multitemporal dialectics. In particular, I argue that the non-synchronic transspatiality of modernity in China is closely tied to the participation of another culture, Japan. Returning to the implications of spatial and temporal companionship suggested by the Russian subliminist, we might treat Japan and China as companions in their discovery of modernity, which occurred for both countries in the late 19th century through Western intervention. However, there were also crucial divergences. To understand the relation between modernities in these two cultures, we should first understand the Chinese and Japanese lexicons associated with modernity. The word modern is generally translated into Chinese as 现代, while the equivalent translation in Japanese is 近代. Using Wang-Hui's recent publication and its Japanese translation as an example, we clearly notice the different renditions. The shared second character of these two terms, 代, refers to an era, generation, or dynasty. The difference in the first character, meanwhile, suggests distinct approaches to historicity. In Chinese, the character 现 refers to the present, while the Japanese character 近 indicates the nearest past. The Japanese version of the modern thus draws a distinction between modern time and the current moment. By contrast, the Chinese version suggests that the modern is inseparable from the present. Despite the countless ties between China and Japan, it is important to recognize such differences in their configuration of modernity. The non-simultaneity of the simultaneous is pointedly evident in the case of China and Japan. Not only do Japan and China have different perceptions of time, but there is a comparable issue when we talk about Russo-Chinese transculturation. Although it may be tempting to regard Russian and Chinese modernity as synchronous, as Liang Qichao suggested in 1903, the historical timelines diverge significantly. We may take as an example the notion of an enlightenment. Not only in Western Europe, but in Russia and China as well, the idea of enlightenment has been associated with a historical turning point in the making of modern world, characterized by a leap toward a freer, more rational society driven by progressive politics. In early 20th century China, intellectuals modeled on their version of modernity on Western ideas associated with the European Enlightenment, including liberty, equality, individualism, and science. Some observers have argued that Chinese Enlightenment remained an unfinished project as national salvation and socialism came to dominate the political stage. Russia, by contrast, aligns more closely with the European trajectory. The Russian Enlightenment is generally perceived as a historical movement associated with the reign of Catherine the Great in the second half of the 18th century. Enlightenment did bring Russia new scientific and secular approaches to culture. However, liberty and equality were never central to the Russian movement. Although Catherine the Great supported artistic, legal, and educational reforms, she had little tolerance for reforms that might undermine her sovereignty. Russian enlightened despotism was far from what Chinese aspired to when they adapted the Enlightenment model. In fact, Chinese revolutionaries fought hard against the centralization of absolute rule and government tyranny. Thus, although both China and Russia drew on Western European ideas and practices and identified Enlightenment with the social progress of the modern era, the interpretation and implementation varied significantly. There are various ways that non-synchronic transspatiality can appear in my chapters. Through these varied cases, I review the diversity and complexity of transspatial modernity. The transcultural linkages established in the book carries rhizomatic features, especially in their heterogeneity and multiplicity. Each case studied in this book is like one of Deleuze and Guattari's Platos, presenting a small fraction of the whole micropolitics of the world of letters. The goal of these case studies is not simply to trace, but ultimately to map out in detail certain segments of global transspatial modernity. Whereas tracing is an organized or stabilized activity, mapping is entirely oriented towards an experimentation in contact with the real. Mapping thus allows for multiple entryways and exits that open onto multifarious forms of interpretation. Hence, the interrogation of each case can eventually be put back on the map for a fuller comprehension of transspatial modernity as a centered and non-hierarchical system defined solely by a circulation of states. Along these lines, transspatial modernity can be summarized as a manner of becoming. Quote, "It has neither beginning nor end, but it always a middle, from which it grows and which it overspills," end quote. In tracing the metamorphosis of Russian modernity in East Asia, this book attempts to break with the conventional narratives of East Asian intellectual development and to unfold diverse facets of Russian culture as they were relayed from one culture to another and finally grew into indispensable components of Chinese modernity. Thus, in this book, I'm not inquiring into the significance to Chinese modernity of Russian or Japanese as individual cultural entities. Instead, I seek to examine Chinese modernity as a translingual and transspatial phenomenon that involves the movements of sentiments, tropes, and ideas across various cultures. By treating modernity as a multifaceted enterprise and examining how Russian culture and literature were relayed through Japan to China, this book endeavors to transcend the binaries of West versus East and old versus new common in the discourse on Chinese modernity. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Xiaolu, for your extremely lucid and comprehensive introduction to your book. I think viewers of this book talk must have learned quite a bit in the past 30 minutes regarding the range, the tremendous scope you have tried to cover in your research, and of course, methodological intervention with the current paradigms of theories and so on and so forth. Based upon your introduction and my personal reading of the book, I probably want to summarize your approach in probably three directions. The first, you talked about translation and transculturation as a phenomenon of relay translation and relay transculturation. And here we are not dealing with merely say a language in rendition or transmission, but also this is really a complex circumstances through which ideas, sentiments, tropes, symbols, and language were brought into contestation and continued sort of play and display on various sites of, say, transspatiality. And secondly, you talked about the necessity of a kind of a triangular approach to comparative literature. And this is, I've found, most enlightening because you are really tackling the current paradigm, whether it's a paradigm contributed by Western theoreticians, Deleuze, Guattari, Casanova, Lydia Liu, and so on and so forth, or on the China side, Wang Hui, and even Li Zhehe, and so on. Mostly, these discourses are based upon kind of a binary opposition, as you pointed out very clearly, the East and the West, and the past and the present, or past and the future, or sometimes the elite and the popular, and so on and so forth. Instead, you are trying to argue that we need to really look into the triangular, say, process through which modernities were being, engaged with, and modernity were becoming something we all want to attend to. And I think this triangular approach probably is also kind of a trope in terms of your methodology, because you can easily talk about them more, say, multifarious and more sort of pointed of connections and communications in the process of transculturation. And the last but not least, of course, you are making a very strong argument in terms of transpatiality vis-a-vis the current paradigm of modernity discourses, which are mostly based upon the polemic of temporality. So this is also extremely ambitious. So altogether, I think this is a really a powerful book in terms of a methodology and a theory. And but particularly for me, however, this very engaged, say, a study of three civilizations in a very volatile time of modern world history, from 1880s to 1930s. These 50 years certainly observed a drastic transformation or even shakeup of the three civilizations in the cultures. So all this being said, I just wanted to actually find out more from you regarding the specifics, because you have talked about the four approaches in terms of your four chapters, in terms of sentiment, in terms of politics, and then the formation of subjectivity, right? The selfhood, humanism, and the last, and the most importantly, language as a kind of a tool and a vehicle of communication. So of all these four chapters, we actually are observing not only cases of encounters, but actually cases of actually entanglements, right? You use the Deleuze and the Guattari theory of a resume at the end of your talk, talking about the extremely complicated engagement between different kind of factors and actors of civilization and beyond in the making of the so-called modern or modernity. So in your experience, when you were working on these four directions, which say struck you as the most inspiring or most challenging in terms of your research? For me, I can tell you that I'm most curious about the last chapter, which is Lu Xun and the hard translation, right? They really demonstrate your mastery of the language. And of course, all of our audience probably was most impressed by your linguistic skill. But in this Lu Xun chapter, you actually are dealing not only with Chinese, Japanese, or Russian, you are actually also dealing with German cases and so on and so forth, right? And still, everything boils down to Lu Xun's insistence on hard translation. So I don't know how you, let's say, come to terms with Lu Xun's insistence on this seemingly the least mediated form of transculturation, right? Hard translation, uninterrupted kind of management of a language through which guest language and host language are brought together. That's my observation, but I don't know which of the four, say, directions that you tackled was most inspiring or challenging to you in your work.
Actually, I would say that initially when I started my project, my goal is to really map out. So I want to have a very clear route, so traveling route. So from Russia to Japan, and then from Japan to China. But as I draw the maps again and again, as I have shown in the the PowerPoints, the map becomes messier and messier as I continue my research. So in the first case study, the traveling route is the clearest probably, because I rely on all the relay translations. So obviously the Japanese used the Russian original, and then the Chinese used the Japanese rendition. So then the route is quite clear. However, when working on just the traveling of the sentiments like love stories, Skull and Beauty paradigm, I also realized how the Chinese culture traveled back into China through the intermediary of Japan unexpectedly, and then afterwards, moving on to the second with nihilists, I realized that okay, Western Europe actually was a part of the game, and then moving on to Tolstoyism, I realized that the significance of Tolstoy couldn't be understood without our understanding of Nietzsche, because both in Russia and right afterwards in Japan, people were comparing the two, juxtaposing them as the two greatest thinkers, in one representing the intellectuals of Western Europe and one representing the intellectuals of Eastern Europe. And then coming to the last case study about Lu Xun's hard translation. So initially, I was just thinking about, well, there has been a lot of discussion about his hard translation as a total failure, how bad the translation was. But indeed, no one actually looked at all the texts that were out there. So I decided to just dig into the German sources and then the Japanese, and also Lu Xun's own translation, of course, comparing it with the original and trying to figure out within Lu Xun's, deep in his heart, like whether he cared more about German or Japanese sources. So this is out of my own curiosity. And also it is a quite interesting example when there were multiple intermediaries as an option, actually, which is closer for the Chinese. In the end, my conclusion after comparing all these sources is that I think Lu Xun is still stay closer to the Japanese. This is quite interesting because he has been talking a lot about how the Western sources or Western European sources are more reliable, and yet in the end, he still kind of feels much closer to the Japanese, and therefore, in many of his linguistic attempts, I would say that he really tried to follow the Japanese innovation. And for this one, for this last case, for example, I think that it actually it's a marvelous case for us to understand the whole vernacularization process, because both in Japan and in China at that time, people were thinking about the modernization of language, and everyone's talking about vernacularization. But based on the writing system, the whole concept of vernacularization in the Western sense simply couldn't be realized literally in East Asia, in Japan, or in China. And so people, and I would say that this kind of phenomenon is more or less like a translingual practice, using Diderot's words, because there were a lot of mismatches, and yet in the end, the goal is still they model on the Western Europe, or they thought that they were trying to model on the Western Europe. But if we look at the Lu Xun's case, well, he's actually looking at Japan. So it's certainly more complicated as a process. So overall, I would say that each case study brought me new inspirations about the whole phenomenon. And in the end, I do believe in Lu Xun's own discussion, like we are all objects in between. So it is, we are always in the middle. So I'm not saying, I'm not even arguing that Russia is the origin or Japan is the origin, because if we think about both in terms of vernacularization or some of the other ideas that I've discussed in other chapters, like humanism or individualism or nihilism. All these ideas, they some of them originated from Western Europe, and in some cases, it's hard to even define an origin. So in the end, I just feel that is why in the end, I decided that to describe the phenomenon I'm seeing as a rhizomatic sort of effect, simply because it's all entangled, as you just mentioned. Yeah.
It's interesting. In the case of Lu Xun's translation, you concluded that he, at the end of his work, seems to be closest to the Japanese translation of other source languages. I think partially, of course, because Lu Xun was still better trained, right, in the Japanese language, right? But still, I think above that, a lot of say factors, I mean, even contingent factors related to the translator's or intellectual's personal disposition, overall ideological or conceptual commitment, and even upbringing of cultural terms. All right, everything affected the outcome of the whole process of translation and transculturation. So I quite agree with you that instead of bogging everything down to merely a kind of a matter of a power brokerage or this so-called as a will to power, knowledge to power, and so on and so forth, very Nietzschean kind of interpretation. That kind of sort of traditional binary opposition should be overcome in terms of our more nuanced understanding of this triangulated or intermediate kind of process of cultural rendition. In that sense, I also was curious about your, say, attitude toward the 周作人, Lu Xun's brother, 周作人's, say, transculturation, right? The way he interpreted a Tolstoyan, a very Christian kind of humanism, and how he managed to turn this Russian source into his own very post-May 4th understanding of individualism. That seems to be also an extremely fascinating itinerary, right, linguistically and conceptually, for us to learn. Do you want to say a few words to that end?
Yeah, sure. That chapter probably is one of the most difficult ones, simply because I'm addressing intellectual history,
right?
And so I for a very long time I was even thinking how to describe Tolstoyism, if not using humanism, like what would be the proper word. And good that eventually one thing that I figured is that it was the Japanese that first described Tolstoyism as humanism, as one sort of intellectual category, together with some other categories, including, for example, Nietzsche's individualism or whatever. So when they are trying to describe all different kinds of schools emerging in the late in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Japanese were using all different kinds of big terms to sort of pin down the thoughts of these European thinkers. There I found the solid ground to start my discussion. Okay, the Japanese indeed processed before the Chinese took Tolstoyism, or to start thinking about Tolstoyism. And indeed, the Chinese adopted the terminology straightforward from Japanese humanism, because both in Japanese and in Chinese, humanism as an English word, or humanitarianism, sometimes they have all different kinds of versions of translations. However, when it comes to Tolstoy, 人道主义 or 京都主义 is the term to describe it. And then as for 周作人's case, so one of the issue that I have always been interested in is how come that initially he started with someone that was quite close to Lu Xun's thoughts, and then eventually just decided to return to his own garden and then to mind his own things. And so over this chapter, when just working on his relationship with Tolstoyism and the transformation of Tolstoyism from Japan to China, one interesting phenomenon that I've figured is that in terms of the writing that he has been reading for him to learn about Tolstoyism, he actually indeed relied a lot on the Japanese sources, so including 𝘊𝘩𝘭𝘵𝘠, which has been discussed a lot by existing scholarship. However, there is also another figure called 𝘊𝘩𝘪𝘯𝘵𝘦𝘳𝑒, who also talked a lot about Tolstoy's humanism. And more or less, these Japanese, when they were processing Tolstoy's humanism, they ditched the altruism part, and they decided that we need to still highlight the value of an individual. And I think that for them, this is quite important. And indeed, it kind of encouraged 𝘐𝑳𝘢 to process Tolstoy's humanism by ways of individualist sort of understanding. And also the other thing is, I think for Tolstoy, he actually eventually advocates some kind of anarchism. He wants to have establish the kind of pure relationship between himself and the God. He doesn't need any other institutions to help him, to assist him, to establish this kind of connection. And for 𝘐𝑳𝘢 as well, in the end, whatever the Tao or something like above that is out there, but he also doesn't need any institutionalization for him to process this relationship. So it's about himself and then something something about the transcendence. So I do think that there also find this kind of connection. So when we think about 𝘐𝑳𝘢, sometimes people were talking about 𝘻我 and the 大我, the little I, and then the big I. And so for 𝘐𝑳𝘢, there's no need for collectivism. There's no need for group activity, because it's all about himself and then the greater idea or whatever he's aiming at. So therefore I sort of tried to I hope that I offered one interpretation of 𝘐𝑳𝘢's individualism. I'm not
absolutely. It's extremely intriguing and fascinating. I certainly have learned quite a bit from this particular chapter. Look, we don't have too much time left, but we do have a couple of questions raised by our viewers. So I don't know whether you could take a look at the question and answers box, or I can actually look at them, and probably just pick one or two for your answer. Maybe I just took a real quick look just now. I think probably the third one maybe is more or less to the point of what you have been talking about. That is, this viewer is wondering, when did the idea of a modernity become self-aware among the Chinese and the Japanese? In other words, the very idea, modernity, became known among Chinese or Japanese first generation of intellectuals, probably around the turn of 20th century, whatever. This is probably kind of the question which pertains to the content of your presentation today, the third one.
Yeah, so as for self-awareness, I don't know when we can count it as self-awareness, because obviously if we think about the May 4th movement, overall this is the people are conscientiously working against the tradition, and so they were trying very hard to draw a line between the past and the modern. However, if we think about the proposal of the word itself, interestingly, it's actually connected somewhat to Russian literature, because one of the sources I found is that 𝘐𝑳𝘢 initially used the word modern to describe Dostoevsky's writing that was actually when in Chinese publications the word modern or modern first got used, and that was actually a translation of an English article. So and then for 周作人, he or at least in this article, it seems that he interprets the Russian modern literature starting from Pushkin. So this would be quite different actually from our contemporary understanding of Russian literature. We would think about the Silver Age or the modernism practice, Akhmenism, Futurism, all those attempts. So obviously, for 周作人's generation, their understanding of what is modern in the Russian literature sense is quite different. And this comes back to my understanding of the non-synchronic modernity.
Good.
Because
Yes.
people are drawing different timelines, but
Yes.
people all believe that they're in the same now.
Yeah, quite true. All right. I actually thought the second attendee's question actually is quite similar to the one we addressed just now. Let me just quickly read it. Have you encountered other situations where words and the phrases are different between the Russian and Chinese translations of literary works? Probably just close to what you were talking about. Wouldn't you say so? I mean, the concept of modern, the concept of youth, and so on and so forth, right? All in all, I think truly this is such a kind of, convoluted process, right? Of adaptation, appropriation, and even approximation in terms of a transculturation. What a fascinating process through which human civilizations, undergo continued transformation and self-transformation. I think our time is coming to an end. I just was wondering if you have anything more to say as a kind of a conclusion remarks in terms of either our conversation today or in terms of your project. And above all, what's the next? After this wonderful project, are you going to continue with something along the line, or you have any new idea about translation and transculturation?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, one of the things that I didn't manage to address in detail in this current book is about the proletarian movement or the leftist movement, simply because it's such a big topic, and I realized that it's impossible to use just one chapter to deal with it. And as a result, in the end, for this current manuscript, I actually kind of cut just stopped before the proletarian literature actually became prominent in China. But as for my next project, this would be the main goal. And my aim is to start from maybe Liang Qichao and beyond, but to look at the connections, and so still approach the leftist movement both in terms of literature and culture, but from the angle of a global movement, as a global movement, because and I want to instead of only talking about one version of the leftist culture, which is Marxism, I want to talk about, for example, anarchism, neoliberalism, all these different intellectual sources that actually the Chinese leftists were drawing on when they were creating their own leftist version. So that will be it's my next project certainly will be a continuation of this current one.
Yeah, this is great, because I noticed that you end with a conclusion in your epilogue talking about Yan'an period and Mao Zedong's accommodation to different kinds of sources of intellectual and ideological promulgation from Russia and Japan by extension. So this is going to be something we are all looking forward to. Right? Xiaolu, thank you so much for your contribution to the field. I believe for viewers who haven't had a chance to read this book, I certainly think this is the first of its own kind. And this is truly a groundbreaking attempt. And I personally benefited a lot from reading it. And I certainly would encourage everybody, whenever you have a chance, take a look at any of those chapters. They are all very, very exciting, right? So I think we will pause here. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming to this platform, sharing your time with Xiaolu and me. And certainly this is a new great series launched by Harvard Asia Center. And I hope you will continue to watch the next episode, another great book to be featured on this platform. Thank you again, everybody. And of course, thank you, Xiaolu, for joining us. And I wish you all a very happy weekend. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, and everyone joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.